This video are all the books that I bought on my recent trip in the US. Everything I brought home in my suitcase. Everything here and here. Uh, I've watched these videos before, like some guy goes to the Goodwill shop and he shows you what he bought. And for some reason, those videos are compelling and fun, so I thought I would do it myself. So these are the books I brought home in my suitcases. So I've talked about this before. One of my passions is travel literature, adventure stories, true life adventure stories, and there seemed to be a big boom of this kind of book that occurred in the early 20th century. So people traveled around like in the teens and the 20s, and then the 30s and 40s, a lot of travel books came out. So whenever I go to a used bookstore, I always ask for this section, and they often have a section. This is Seven Grass Huts. This is an engineer's wife in Central and South America. Seems interesting. Then here's another one I bought at the same place. I actually went back there twice, and they had a different version of this book, and I accidentally bought that too. So I bought two copies of this. This is The Royal Road to Romance by Richard Halliburton, of all people. And I love stuff like this. It's an old used book. This book belongs to Margaret Tillison Craig. Wherever you are, Margaret, I love and I cherish your book. It's always funny to think about your books just being spewed out into the world after you die. I mean, you think you buy something and it's yours forever. And it's yours for your own forever, but that's about it. So I don't know really what this is about, but it is one of those travelogue books by somebody. I think he went to a bunch of different places I like and I'm interested in, including Thailand. See, just opening these books are already getting my nose stuffed up. This is one I'd wanted for a long time. The Dungeon Master, The Disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III. This is the story of this is the story of a guy who was connected to Dungeons and Dragons and then disappeared and died somehow or killed himself, and it led to some of the moral outrage over Dungeons and Dragons and about the misunderstanding of that game in the 80s. But this is the original story about the guy, the truth behind the story that became endless urban legends about the evils of Dungeons and Dragons. This is another one I really wanted. This is, I think he just died, Norman Lear, his autobiography. Even this I get to experience. This is the guy behind a lot of development of a lot of shows, Sanford and Son, All in the Family, Maude, Jefferson's Different Strokes. Certainly someone who created the tenor of the times he was in, and I especially like this idea. You know, when something crazy happens to you, you can just say, well, even this I get to experience. I think maybe this is some kind of a Yiddishy or kind of a fatalistic type of quote that such a person would use. Might be very useful in our lives when things fall upon our heads and we have no choice but to endure them. This is an omnibus. I already took the cover, the dust cover off. This is before Watchmen. It's a compendium of all the other comics that they spun off of those characters in Watchmen. I know the original creator of the story disavowed all further stories, especially a lot of these that try to recast the psychotic characters that he formulated in Watchmen as traditional superheroes and to fit them into like the DC continuity. And I've read a few of these. Some are kind of intriguing, some are terrible, but I don't know. I just always liked the Watchmen and everything connected with it, and I got this for a good price. This is part of another one of my fascinations. I'm interested in the fall of capitals in rebellions or wars. So I've read all the first-person accounts and all the historical accounts of the fall of Saigon and the fall of Phnom Penh, during the American Vietnam War era. But the one I wasn't clear on was exactly how Laos fell in the Vietnam War. And I've already been reading this because it is a fascinating subject. Of course, Laos was and still is a backwater. Essentially, the reductive story, the answer is Laos is just a tiny country that got caught up in big things that it wasn't really a part of, and it didn't really relate to, and sometimes that's what happens. You get smashed in between other people's affairs. But I wanted to understand the story. And when I looked it up, I'm not even sure this book is still in print. And this has been reissued under a couple different titles. But this is Backfire, the Secret War in the CIA's Secret War in Laos, and it's linked to the war in Vietnam by Robert Warner. But this is supposed to be the key book that explains the Vietnam War in Laos. I don't know how that got in there. Alexa, stop. This is something, I don't know why I bought it. It was, like when you're on Amazon searching for books, and they're saying people who bought this book also bought these other things. This is part of long tail selling. If you look up the new marketing lingo, that you can carry every book under the sun and submit it to people by looking at the algorithm. Guide to Hiking China's Old Road to Shu by Hope Justman. It's a big book, lots of stuff. I don't know. Kind of interesting. China's its own world, its own universe. It's like its own planet. Lots of neat places to explore. That just intrigued me. This is the Ba'ath Party, a history from its origins to 1966. This is the political party in in Iraq that Saddam Hussein eventually took over. This is sort of a I'm not sure if I'm able to say this word, fascist organization. I was kind of interested in reading about some of these movements in the 20th century that, I don't know, America, we never hear anything about until we're bombing the country. But I just thought this was fascinating. This is, I think, an old library book, and the Ba'ath Party. Here's a cliff guide to Faulkner's The Unvanquished I came across. I try not to read anything like this before I read the book, because it presets my mind. Even anymore, I don't like to read movie reviews before I go to a movie, because I end up with the same opinion that the movie reviewer has. But I would say I'm a scholar of Faulkner, especially his early classics, all of the great period in the early days. But the later stuff I'm less familiar with, and when I've read it, I find it's less good. And that is indeed, if you are a great writer, you probably have some small period in which all your classics are written, and even if you write later on, nothing will eclipse those ones. But anyway, this had Faulkner on it, so I bought it. Here we have Confessions of a Ghost Hunter. I have another copy of this. I have read it before, but I can't find that copy. This is a great, interesting book about a paranormal investigator. Confessions of a Ghost Hunter by Harry Price. This has a lot of important things in it. You know, when you get back in the early 20th century, everything was about seances and mysticism and that kind of stuff, which you don't really hear that much about anymore. But it was a big fad, I guess, late 19th century, early 20th century. And there were a lot of people who investigated and often debunked it, such as like Harry Houdini and Henry Price. This also has the famous story, which I love, in it about Geth. You may have seen some YouTube videos about the talking mongoose. There was a little mongoose in the house that would talk to people, and it would talk to you if you were there, and you just couldn't see it. It was in the floorboards or in the walls or something. He investigated that, and that story of Geth, G-E-F, is from this book. And this, I got another one of my favorites. I mean, when I went to school in Los Angeles, I lived 4 blocks from Melrose Comics. It was a golden age of creativity in comics. So many interesting things came out. Then you can call them comics. They were graphic novels, comics that grew up. This is Paul Chadwick's Concrete. I believe it won the Eisner. Incredible art. You know, I don't hear people talk about it anymore, but it's wonderful. He's kind of a superhero, but he doesn't do superhero things. It's this guy who was taken by aliens, and when they brought him back, he's encased in this body of cement, and then the aliens leave, and he's just a cement man, and he tries to. You can't make a living, like he can't dial the phone because his hands are fat fingers, and he hadn't have any genitals, but he's alive. He doesn't know how long he's going to live, and he can go underwater and do a lot of things. So he tries to recast himself as a hero in the real world, and all the things that happen to him as he tries to promote himself and live his life, and come to terms with what has happened to him. Paul Chadwick. I haven't heard from him for years. I don't know where he is. This is a wonderful thing, and I already posted on my Instagram about it. This is a comic, very limited edition by Felipe Flores. He does sort of, I think it's kind of 70s era, Bronze Age, reconstitutions of characters. So here's a comic book of the Phantom Menace, but it's in the style of Felipe Flores, in a retro kind of style. It's called The Menace of the Phantom, and boy oh boy, neat text, neat graphics. It is I don't know, it's look at that. This is like Flash Gordon, maybe. The Menace of the Phantom. Marvelous. Fun stuff. Here's Jar Jar. The new Jar Jar. Anyway, I could just spend hours with this. Wonderful, wonderful thing. Next thing is from R to Zap, Harvey Kurtzman's Visual History of the Comics. I think this is one thing I heard from it's a kayfabe cartoonist that were, there used to be 2 guys who would sometimes they would they would find these old books, most of them out of print, and talk about them, and they talked about this one, I believe. I don't want to read all old comics or graphic novels, but I do like a kind of short compendium that gives me a taste, that I could kind of see what some of them were like, learn something about sequential storytelling. is for sale at Walmart at the checkout. And for years I thought, surely there's a market for at least reprints of stuff like this. I mean, you don't have to hire new artists or do any new work, or maybe you do mostly reprints and just put one or two things from current movies, but they've got such a backlog of fun things, and I read these when I was a kid, and I thought it'd be fun to read them again. So I'm sure this people got to be picking this up. This is just a book of mad reprints. It's another thing from Cartoonist Kayfabe, Unseen Peanuts, otherwise known as Forbidden Peanuts. It's a collection of all the prints that all the strips that Charles Schulz pulled out of publication or out of the reprints for various reasons, like characters were not correct in what they were saying in terms of their characterization, like something that Charlie Brown would be expected to say is coming out of Lucy's mouth just because he wasn't thinking about it when he drew it, or things are drawn weirdly off model, and maybe some other things too. I think this was a free comic book day book years ago, so I think there's still versions of it out there. Thank goodness we have eBay. This is one of the FASA game playing kits from either late 70s, early 80s, before the new canon from the Star Wars movies. This is the Cadet Orientation Source Book. There's a whole box of this, but this was interesting. I wanted to set aside to read. Lots of lore from that early FASA stuff. You know, it sets up that Axanar battle stuff. You can see videos of it on YouTube. I love fake histories like this, especially when it fills in Star Wars, one of my favorite fake history things. This is some little pocket book. The Pocket Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know, I guess a Vietnamese Buddhist thinker. I like this size. I'd love to get some little ones like this with Shakespeare in them, maybe with bigger print. This was a used bookstore, like 50 cents. Had to pick it up. This is another Cartoonist Kayfabe. This, I think, was the first Cartoonist Kayfabe I went out and get. Art Out of Time. Oh, it's so neat. It's so this guy, Dan Nadell, compiled the works from obscure cartoonists that are unknown today or forgotten or we don't know anything about, that have weird art styles or weird subject matter or just notable in some way, but were completely forgotten even in their time. And there are some wild and wonderful, interesting things here. Perhaps things that rival Winsor McCay's work, but just the people are forgotten in today, unknown. They just don't know much about some of these people. Some are so incompetent, they're sort of surrealists and almost brilliant. I can't remember. I have a couple of these old Smithsonian Book of Comic Book Comics. Another fun compendium just to see a variety of different comics that I hadn't seen before. I had this in my Sheltering Sky video. I wanted a little reading copy because I like to travel to Laos, and every time I go to Laos I like to read the entire Sheltering Sky. I can divide it between like 3 days or 4 days and read the whole thing. It's not a long book, but this book turned out to be so beautiful. It's I can't remember if it's in the late 50s or early 60s style. They've done it up like it's a romance novel, which it really isn't. You'll be depressed out of your mind, but it has a lot to say to you when you're traveling to far off places all alone. So I love this artwork. I love the artwork. This is one of my favorites of adventure, true life literature, nonfiction, Henry de Montfrid. I've also heard it said as Henri de Montfrid. I think this is his only book that's still in print. It's called Hashish, but I think the actual title was something much longer. Hashish, A Smuggler's Tale. I have another video about his works before. He was a guy in the teens and the 20s. He was a French guy. He worked around the Gulf of Aden in very primitive colonial times in a little boat with a sail, and got involved in pearl cultivation and smuggling guns and hashish. And he eventually got so tanned and so fluent in the local language, I believe Arabic, that no one could pick him out as a Frenchman. And he initially told his tale to another lady, and that book became a sensation, I think, in the late 20s. But then he went on to write his own series of books in his own words. So it's wonderful that hardly any of these travelers' tales are still in print, but there's a lot to recommend this guy, Henry or Henri de Montfrid, his work. If you want an introduction to this travel literature, you get the feel of what it was like to be way, way out in the middle of nowhere, and to have hostile, unfriendly British colonial forces everywhere, and the French, and be wrapped up in that colonial age. Certainly no safety net. I believe this is another kayfabe one, Peanuts, The Art of Charles M. Schulz. Over the years since I was a kid, I had a lot of these. I have compendiums of some of them. I was interested in this because it explains the style of art, why things were drawn a certain way, how it evolved to a greater degree and with a greater focus than any other works. And as you see, it's filled with style. And I've always been interested in character, commercial character development, like a mascot for something. And I'm interested in simplified characters like this, or like The Simpsons, that you can kind of see from just the outline of the character who it is, and how much emotion you can impart, how much heart you can impart, not by doing a lot of drawing, but just doing a little bit of simplified lines. This is something I found my parents in their house. They had an old biography of a person named Stevie Smith. And I know a lot about literature. I'd never heard of her. Maybe that makes me a dummy, or I don't know as much as I thought I did. But I found out she was a person in the 1920s wrote experimental fiction novels, including this one, Novel on Yellow Paper, and various other things throughout her life too. But was a trendsetter, much like William Faulkner, in the use of fiction, of innovating in fiction writing. So I got this. This is her most famous novel. I just happened across this in the bookstore after I'd ordered another book from her, which I also have here. This is a book that I just brought home that I had before. This is The Portable Faulkner. The story about him is, he had his books out in the 20s and 30s, the greatest books, and they just had print runs in the thousands, and they were there and gone. That had critical acclaim, but little else. Sometime at the end of World War II, or at the close of World War II, printing houses said, let's make a series of like portable versions of our author's works to see if we can revive public interest. And one of them they did was A Portable Faulkner. And so this has selections from a lot of his different works. And this ignited for the first time widespread public interest in Faulkner's work, especially his early all-time classic literature work, like The Sound and the Fury, A Light in August, those sorts of books. Um, uh, and it is interesting because, it does tell us about sometimes you can be too far ahead of your time. So back when all those works came out initially, he people weren't as interested at them, and then the maybe more sophisticated reading public at the end of World War II was ready to enjoy those kind of works, and it allowed Faulkner to write again and be very successful and win the Pulitzer, I believe, a couple times for books that were probably undeserved. It was more for his past work, which now had entered the public consciousness, and he was seen as one of the greats. Here is another of these adventure nonfiction, Juka, the Bush. I don't know if you're allowed to say that word anymore. They change the rules all the time. The Bush person of Dutch Guiana. And I was drawn to this because it still had its tattered, dust cover on it. And nice graphics inside a map. I love a book that has a map. Ever since I was in the 5th grade when I first read Lord of the Rings. I didn't understand it all, but I thought it was fascinating. You have a map in a book, and so this is also filled with drawings and photo plates. I tried to open to one of them. I mean, a lot of photo plates, a lot of drawings, and it's about some guys traveling around in Africa. Oh, no, it isn't. Not Africa. Maybe, I don't know. There's Africa, but also, see, here's Guyana. So I don't know. I have to read it to find out. But it's quite interesting to read the synopsis. Another, like a 50-cent one, Anything by Woody Allen, is amazingly witty and funny. Candide Voltaire. I'm actually writing something that kind of references the quote from this, "We must cultivate our garden." So I wanted to have a little condensed version of it to read for fun. Anyway. Another cheap one, like 50 cents, Isaac Dinesen, Anecdotes of Destiny and Engrengard. I don't know what, but this is the person that most people would be familiar with Isaac Dinesen as the author of Out of Africa, that was made into a movie in the early 80s. Was one of the kind of not very good movies that won Best Picture, like Chariots of Fire, Out of Africa. One of those prestige pictures, but I'd always been intrigued about what was her prose like, so I'll find out. I already started to read this, John Dos Passos. I'd heard of him before. Fascinating. It's another very cheap book. I don't know. I think is thought of as a great author. You don't hear about him referenced that much anymore, I don't think. But this is the fun thing about when you go to old bookstores or book sales. An author can come to you in a way unbidden, and you'll discover something wonderful. So far, this is very nice. This was a Stevie Smith kind of compendium of poetry and various writings that I bought on Amazon before I found the other novel at the bookstore for like 50 cents. So I'll be reading some Stevie Smith. This is another old library book, Mark Twain, God's Fool. This was about his later years, which were unhappy, as very often our later years are when we start to decay. And I'm very interested in that now that I'm closer to the end than I am to the beginning. Much closer, if I tell the truth, but that it's seemed intriguing. I'm more interested in that story about Twain than his actual writing. His writing, I know it was a sensation during his own age, but it never thrilled me. Maybe it's because they forced me to read it when I was in school. This is Others Unknown by the lawyer who represented Timothy McVeigh. And this just intrigued me because I remember watching when the Oklahoma City bombing happened and all the news, and I had several news channels on, and the police were all showing the identikit sketches of the two people they were searching for. One guy who was McVeigh and another guy who was with him, by all accounts. After they found him, the whole story changed, and there was no ever reference to another person who was with him. And I'm not the only person who saw this or remembered this, so there was always the sense that there were other guys that knew about the plot that they roped in and I think are still in jail, but as direct accomplices on the day, there was always a question about that or how deep it went. And even in McVeigh's final statement before he was executed, he referenced saying, "Oh, I did it all alone," because there was still the rumors swirling about this. So this is some book that attempts maybe to say there were other people involved, and it just sort of intrigued me. The conspiratorial nature in my mind, because the government would never tell us just something we want to hear. This is something I found at the old house. This is a book I had since childhood. I put a plastic cover on it. This is a Gold Key reprint of all the old Star Trek. Some of these are highly regarded, but I'll have to read them again. I know when I was a kid I had fun reading this. It's the covers. It was read so much when I was a little kid. The covers are kind of almost like fabric. They've been turned so many times, but we'll see. Most of the time when one goes back to read old comic books or even graphic novels from the 80s that we thought were great and we were told were great and we assumed were great, often they're terrible. So anyway, maybe I'll have to look at this through a kid's eyes again. This is something I'd wanted for some time. This is a Norton Critical edition of Faulkner's Light in August. Light in August is one I've read several times recently, and I really latched onto it, and it interests me. From Faulkner's classic era, his early classic era. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what are the books. There's The Sound and Fury. What's the one? The Death in the Family and the Fish and the corpses in the back. The super famous one. I don't know. There's 5 of them. This is one of the classics from the classic era, great literature. It's the only one that's not very much wrapped up in family. So he uses the same. There's several characters that are interwoven and are having different stories, yet they're not family. That makes it kind of unique, and I like to study that because if you know the stuff I've written, I have multiple characters doing multiple things all the time. So anytime I can find books that do that, I'm quite interested in it. So I was interested to get the Norton Critical edition and see all the old reviews and the new reviews, what people think of it, and any notes that they have. This is the 40s, fiction, poetry, and drama, which are various critical pieces on books there. And I can't remember why this is another great old, for some reason I just love having old library books. I at some point, maybe in college, I was given a Xerox copy of one essay in here. I can't remember which one it was. And then I tracked down the whole book just to read that, this. And so why this is interesting is that very often the way we appraise books says more about the period we are in when we're appraising it than the book itself. And so it can be very different than critical appraisal today. Critical appraisal today is all about gender and sexuality and wondering if what the writer has written means he's actually gay, or it's part of his experience of a certain group or that group. It's always that way, you know. So for critique, we pull out the threads that we think are important at the time and apply them to works of the past to kind of draw them into our own era and make them relevant for us. So sometimes if you read old blocks of critiques from works from a certain time, of works of a certain time, you could see things in a very different perspective because they have different things that they're interested in that time as opposed to in our own present day. Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorites. I've got her short stories. I've got her short stories always at the ready here. Several good videos on my site if you want to know how you can apply Flannery O'Connor's writing to your own writing and creating characters. So anyway, this was another one of those long tail books in marketing where when I was looking up Flannery O'Connor on Amazon, they suggested this. I'd never heard of it before. It's some kind of some journals and poems, including the original pages they were on. Kind of interesting, so I got it. And finally, I have met this guy before in the past. You know, in some of my old incarnation, I was an analyst for countries in Asia. My first book was about Thai politics or Thai thought in 2013's The Thai Book. So I'm always very interested in understanding how little countries in Southeast Asia or Asia work, big countries or small countries, how their perspective of the world is, how they really interrelate to different countries. So this guy, the author of this book, wrote this, Imperfect Partners, United States and Southeast Asia. And this goes through each of the countries from his own experience as a diplomat about how the United States interacts with each of these countries, what their issues are, and how they see the world, what's important to them. It's completely different than how an American would see it. And understanding these things is key to being able to exert your influence in a region. You got to understand what the priorities are of others. So anyway, that's what I think it's about. When I read it, I'll know. So that is my haul from my trip. And I hope you enjoyed it. This is my first video like this. If you like it, like and comment or subscribe. And I will see you next time. And we'll talk about politics or books or who knows what. Bye-bye.